right-wing court disagreed with Texas. Understand that. Greg Abbott's Texas is going too far for even this Supreme Court. And here's the real gag. Greg Abbott wants to go much, much further. The first thing Greg Abbott said in a statement he issued addressing his refusal to remove the borders was that, quote, the federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. Greg Abbott is going straight Southern Confederacy. Let's secede from the United States and Civil War this bitch out. I mean, he explicitly embraced the Confederate theory of secession, which is called the Compact Theory. If you've never heard of the Compact Theory, it was the basis of the secession acts of the 13 Confederate states, when South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, and Texas seceded in 1860 because they couldn't stand for a world without their slaves. In the secession acts, which obviously preceded the Civil War, the 13 Confederate states declared that they were dissolving the Union that was united under the Compact, that is, the Constitution. The argument was, and is, essentially, that America was formed through the consent of the states, through a compact agreed upon, the Constitution. The argument is that each state is in and of itself its own independent sovereign nation that agreed to a compact under the Constitution and can thus void that contract and thus the federal law and their constitutional obligations. That's how, in the minds of the Confederacy, they were independent nations who were free to void the Constitution and enter into a separate compact, the Confederacy, just so they could keep their slaves. Pay close attention listening to the language in this quote that I'm about to read, y'all. Yes, it's a little long and in Old English, but it is necessary. Listen. Listen to the shit that they are saying because we are going to compare in a moment. On February 2nd, 1861, Texas declared via their Declaration of Causes, which impelled the state of Texas to secede from the federal union. Quote, Texas abandoned her separate national existence and consented to become one of the Confederate states to promote her welfare, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure more substantially the blessings of peace and liberty to her people. She was received into the Confederacy with her own constitution, under the guarantee of the federal constitution and the compact of annexation, that she should enjoy these blessings. She was received as a Commonwealth holding, maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Her institutions and geographical position established the strongest ties between her and other slave-holding states of the Confederacy. Those ties have been strengthened by association. But what has been the course of the government of the United States and of the people and authorities of the non-slave-holding states since our connection with them? The controlling majority of the federal government, under various pretenses and disguises, has so administered the same as to exclude the citizens of the southern states unless under odious and unconstitutional restrictions from all the immense territory owned in common by all the states on the Pacific Ocean, for the avowed purpose of requiring sufficient power in the common government to use it as a means of destroying the institutions of Texas and her sister slave-holding states by the disloyalty of the northern states and their citizens and the imbecility of the federal government. Infamous combinations of incendiaries and outlaws have been permitted in those states and the common territory of Kansas to trample upon the federal laws, to war upon the lives and property of southern citizens in that territory, and finally, by violence and mob law, to usurp the possession of the same as exclusively the property of the northern states. The federal government, while but partially under the control of these, our unnatural and sectional enemies, has for years almost entirely failed to protect the lives and property of the people of Texas against the Indian savages on our border, and more recently against the murderous forays of banditti from the neighboring territory of Mexico. And when our state government has expended large amounts for such purpose, the federal government has refused reimbursement, therefore, thus rendering our condition more insecure and harassing than it was during the existence of the Republic of Texas. In other words, Texas is our own motherfucking place. We only agreed to be here if it would benefit us. And it needed to benefit us with our slaves that we said we was going to have forever, and with all the money given to us to keep these goddamn Native Americans and Latinos off the land, goddamn it. And if that's not happening, the federal government is in breach of what the we agreed to. Because we agreed to slaves forever, and keeping these slaves, these Latinos, and these Native Americans in their place. And because the federal government ain't doing it, Texas is overrun with the stress of these goddamn migrants stealing from us and being criminals and costing us money. So we are going to go secede and kick it with the other southern states because we want our slaves, damn it, and keep them Mexicans off our land. That's what they said. That's what they said. Now, I need you to compare that language from Confederate Texas in 1861 to the statement released by Greg Abbott on January 24th, 2024. Quote from Greg Abbott: "The federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. The executive branch of the United States has a constitutional duty to enforce federal laws protecting states, including immigration laws on the books right now. President Biden has refused to enforce those laws and has even violated them. The result is that he has smashed records for illegal immigration. Despite having been put on notice in a series of letters, one of which I delivered to him by hand, President Biden has ignored Texas's demand that he perform his constitutional duties. President Biden has violated his oath to faithfully execute immigration laws enacted by Congress. Instead of prosecuting immigrants for federal crime of illegal entry, President Biden has sent his lawyers into federal court to sue Texas for taking action to secure the border. President Biden has instructed his agencies to ignore federal statutes that mandate the detention of illegal immigrants. The effect is to illegally allow their en masse parole into the United States. By wasting taxpayer dollars to tear open Texas's border security infrastructure, President Biden has enticed illegal immigrants away from the 28 legal entry points along the state's southern border, bridges where nobody drowns, into the dangerous waters of the Rio Grande. Under President Biden's lawless border policies, more than 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years. That is more than the population of 33 different states in this country. This illegal refusal to protect the states has inflicted unprecedented harm on the people all across the United States. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and the other visionaries who wrote the U.S. Constitution foresaw that states should not be left to the mercy of a lawless president who does nothing to stop external threats like cartels smuggling millions of illegal immigrants across the border. That is why the framers included both Article 4, Section 4, which promises that the federal government shall, quote, protect each state against invasion, and Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which acknowledges the state's sovereign interest in protecting their borders. Mind you, he's quoting a dissent. He's quoting Scalia's dissent in Arizona versus the United States. The failure of the Biden administration to fulfill the duties imposed by Article 4, Section 4 has triggered Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which reserves to this state the right of self-defense. For these reasons, I have already declared an invasion under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 to invoke Texas's constitutional authority to defend and protect itself. That authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes to the contrary. The Texas National Guard, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and other Texas personnel are acting on that authority as well as state law to secure the Texas border. Both of those letters and declarations should make a few things clear, not least of which being that Texan hysteria about migrants, we the blacks and Native Americans, but mostly the commitment to criminalize Mexicans in specific, and using that as a justification for taking power and enacting violence and war is deeply, deeply, deeply Texas, Confederate, racist shit. One is in Old English and the other is new, but they went from calling Mexicans banditti in 1861 to drug smuggling cartel members in 2024. But most importantly, this should make clear that these motherfuckers talking secession, and where there is secession, there is civil war. And instead of just 13 states like we had during the Declaration of Secession in 1861 and the subsequent Civil War, this time we have 25 states backing Texas against the federal government. And they've already signed their joint statement. The 25 states eager to see this country's union crumble are who you'd expect them to be. But I'm going to name them because I believe in naming and shaming. Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming. And if you're still deluding yourself to believe that Greg Abbott and every other Republican governor responsible for a state who is backing him means anything other than business, please know that after the Supreme Court's ruling, the Lieutenant Governor Patrick not only told us they were going to continue to put up more wire, he said that he went to the border to, quote, thank them, support them, and also to stand with them, just in case the Biden administration sent Border Patrol. He said that wisely the Biden administration didn't send the Border Patrol there. He said that we're thankful they didn't because we don't want a confrontation, but we want this border secure. So in other words,
that's what concerns me a little bit, you know what I mean? But, I'll pack that thing too. So you come around this way, you will get caught.
Listen, even if you're a demon yourself or just someone who's bought into American propaganda that you should just do it the right way, so you could care less about the migrants dying and being maimed at the border, you aren't in any less danger by what it means that Abbott is refusing to listen to both the federal government and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is meant to serve as the final check in our system of checks and balances. If states simply disregard the Supreme Court, their authority will become meaningless, and so too do the constitutional rights they've recognized and are tasked with defending. And this isn't just political theory mumbo jumbo, it's very much a real thing. You probably remember this from high school, but the Supreme Court actually used to be very weak at the beginning of this nation's history. The Supreme Court was meant to be the, quote, least dangerous branch of the government, because they had no soldiers or money to make people do what they wanted, according to Alexander Hamilton. In other words, you can make some rulings, sure, but if we don't want to do it, what you gonna do about it, pussy? So, SCOTUS was weak as until your boy John Marshall came around in 1803 and established judicial review in the very famous case I know you're remembering now, Marbury versus Madison. Judicial review isn't explicitly said in the Constitution, but Marshall believed it was obviously inferred that the Supreme Court had the right to decide whether something was unconstitutional. And that's really the beginning of the court beginning to get some respect around this bitch. And when that authority has been challenged, it's posed significant threat to marginalized people. For example, you remember Brown versus Board of Education, when the Supreme Court ruled that separate wasn't equal and thus the laws requiring Black and white people to attend segregated schools were unconstitutional, which, ironically enough, is one of the major cases where the South raised the compact theory argument in court to justify why they had the right to segregate schools and ignore the court. Well, the South, the Confederate States, weren't having that. They weren't having it so much that they literally organized what's known as the Massive Resistance, or the Stanley Plan. It was a plan used by Senator Harry Byrd. It had a lot of legs on it, on how the state would use their funds, and they would create discriminatory boards to prevent Black students from getting into schools. But that was the least of what the governors were willing to do. The Arkansas governor sent the National Guard to help the segregationists prevent Black children from entering the schools altogether. An incident that became known as the Little Rock Crisis, because President Eisenhower considered using the National Guard as the Little Rock Nine had to cross a mob and armed officers just to exercise their rights to enter and go to the school, because the southern states had decided that they don't give a less what the Supreme Court had to say. The court would go on to have to reaffirm its ruling in a case called Brown versus Board 2, and then finally in a case called Cooper versus Aaron, where they had to not just reaffirm Brown and Brown 2, but to explicitly reject the compact theory and state that the states had no right to nullify or ignore their decisions in Brown and Brown 2. You know how they always tell us if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it? This is why. Because what's happening now has happened before, and we should understand the magnitude of what's to come and how people suffer when states decide to buck the systems of checks and balances to do the inhumane things that they want to do. But Greg Abbott is not just bad on immigration or the Constitution. He is also